The night smelled of ash and blood. Smoke curled against the darkened sky, the remnants of a city swallowed by war. She had no name here, only a title spat from enemy tongues. Spoils of war. Her wrists ached where the ropes bit into them. Each jolt of the cart rattled her bones, the iron wheels cutting deep into the earth as it carried her and the other captives away from everything they had ever known. Some wept quietly, others sat in hollow silence, their faces streaked with soot and sorrow. She did neither. Her grief was buried beneath something colder, heavier, an exhaustion so deep it had settled into her very marrow. The enemy had come before dawn, their banners tearing through the sky like carrion birds. Fire had swallowed her father's halls. The screams of the dying had risen into the heavens, prayers unanswered. And she, once the daughter of a noble house, once proud and untouchable, had been dragged from the wreckage of her world, bound and branded as nothing more than a prize. The camp reeked of sweat, leather, and unwashed bodies. She was pulled from the cart and shoved forward, her steps stumbling against the uneven ground. Around her, soldiers celebrated, drinking and boasting of their spoils. Somewhere, a man laughed as a jeweled dagger changed hands in a bet. She was worth more than that dagger once. A guard gripped her arm and led her past rows of tents until they reached a larger pavilion, its entrance marked by 2 burning torches. Inside, the air was warmer, the flickering light casting shifting shadows against the thick canvas. And there, seated at a rough-hewn table, was the man to whom she had been given. He was not what she had imagined. She had heard stories of warlords, of men who took what they wanted and cared little for the wreckage they left behind. He did not look like a brute. His armor was dark, marked by battle but well kept. His shoulders were broad, his posture composed, a quiet control radiating from him. His face, scarred but not unhandsome, was unreadable as he studied her. The guard shoved her forward, forcing her to her knees. "General, your share of the spoils." A flicker of something passed through his eyes, gone before she could name it. He leaned back slightly, fingers drumming against the armrest of his chair. "Did she fight?" "Not when we found her. Most of her household was already dead." Pause. He exhaled a slow, measured breath. "Leave us." The guard hesitated, then nodded and stepped out, letting the tent flap fall closed behind him. Silence. She stayed kneeling, her muscles locked with defiance she could not afford. The flickering torchlight danced between them, illuminating the space where words should be. He did not move, did not demand anything of her. That more than anything unnerved her. "You can stand," he said at last, his voice even. She did not move. A ghost of a smile touched his lips as if he understood. "Very well." More silence. Her mind raced, assessing, calculating. He had power, enough to command men who would slaughter for him. If he wished, he could destroy her as easily as a breath snuffing out a candle. And yet he had not touched her. Had not demanded her obedience, her submission. Finally she spoke, her voice hoarse from disuse. "What do you intend to do with me?" His expression did not change. "What would you have me do?" The question struck her like a slap. She expected orders, commands, cruelty. "Not this." "I am not a fool," she said, her chin lifting slightly. "I know what happens to women taken in war." Something in his gaze hardened, a flicker of displeasure. "Yes. You do." She braced herself, waiting. He would strip her of dignity as easily as he had stripped her of freedom. He would take what he wished, and she, like countless others before her, would have no say in the matter. He stood, stepped toward her. Slowly, deliberately. She refused to shrink away. He reached for his belt and she fought the urge to recoil, only to see him pull free a dagger. Not to use against her but to press into her hands. Her fingers curled instinctively around the hilt, her breath catching. "If you think I will harm you," he said quietly, "use it." Her pulse thundered in her ears. Was this a trick? A test? No man would place a weapon in the hands of his captive unless he was either impossibly arrogant, or something else entirely. She gripped the blade tighter, testing its weight, feeling the cool steel against her palm. He watched her waiting, daring her. But she did not move. He nodded as if she had confirmed something for him. Then, without another word, he turned and left her alone in the flickering glow of the torches. She remained still long after he was gone, the dagger cold in her grasp, her mind warring with itself. She had expected a monster. A tyrant. Instead she had been given a choice. And she did not know whether that terrified her more. Days bled into nights, yet she remained a captive. Not in chains, not bound by ropes, but by the weight of uncertainty. He had not touched her, nor had he ordered her to serve him as she had feared. Instead he had done something far worse. He had left her alone with her thoughts. The dagger he had given her still rested beneath her sleeping mat, hidden but never forgotten. She had not used it, not against him, not against herself. That alone unsettled her. The camp bustled with the rhythm of war. Soldiers sharpened their blades, drank their fill, boasted of past victories. They did not speak to her, but they watched. Some with curiosity, others with resentment. A few with something darker in their eyes. She had expected cruelty, perhaps even force, but none dared lay a hand on her. She understood why soon enough. He had made it clear she was not to be harmed. But protection was not the same as freedom. She watched him from a distance, studying the man who had become both her captor and her guardian. He was not needlessly cruel, but neither was he kind. He spoke little, commanded much, and kept his thoughts hidden behind an unreadable gaze. She hated him for his silence. Hated that he had not been the monster she needed him to be. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, she found herself summoned. He stood near the outskirts of the camp, watching the distant hills, his posture heavy with thought. She approached warily, the memory of the dagger in her mind, though she did not bring it. "You're restless," he said without looking at her. She stiffened. "I am a prisoner. Would you expect me to be content?" A trace of amusement flickered across his face. "I expect you to be honest." Honest. The word felt foreign on her tongue. She had spent days weighing every action, every word, waiting for the moment he would reveal the truth of his intentions. But he had given her nothing. No cruelty, no kindness, only questions with no answers. "You are not what I expected," she admitted finally. "Nor are you." She glanced at him, uncertain whether his words held meaning beyond what was spoken. But before she could decide, a voice interrupted them. "My lord." A soldier approached, his expression tense. "There is trouble at the northern edge of the camp." His gaze shifted, sharpening. Without another word he moved, expecting her to follow. And against all reason she did. A small crowd had gathered near the supply tents. 2 soldiers stood in the center, one clutching a bloodied nose, the other grinning with the satisfaction of a man who had landed the first blow. Around them, others cheered, some taking bets, others taunting. The moment they saw him, the noise quieted. The victorious soldier turned, his grin faltering. He was taller than most, broad-shouldered and thick with muscle, the kind of man who enjoyed battle more than he feared it. And the moment his gaze landed on her, she knew. He had seen that look before. "My lord," the soldier said, dipping his head, though there was no true respect in his tone. "We were just having a bit of sport." His eyes flicked back to her and she understood the unspoken meaning. She had been spared thus far, but the camp had begun to wonder why. She was still a woman taken in war, still a prize unclaimed. They were waiting. Watching. Testing the boundaries of her captor's restraint. The general's voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. "Do you wish to challenge me, Wren?" The man's grin faltered. "Of course not, my lord." "Then do not mistake my silence for permission." For a moment the tension thickened, the air between them charged with something dangerous. But then Wren dipped his head in mock obedience and stepped back. The gathered soldiers dispersed, some whispering, others casting lingering looks her way. She had not fought, had not spoken, yet she had been at the center of it. A battle she had no part in, yet one that had been fought on her behalf. He turned to her. "Come." She hesitated, but there was no choice to be made. Not really. Back at his tent he did not sit, did not turn away. He studied her, his expression unreadable. "You understand now," he said. She did. He was not safe. Not truly. Whatever protection he had given her was built on the fragile foundation of his authority, and that authority was being questioned. "Why do you do this?" she demanded. "Why not just take what you want?" He did not answer immediately. Instead he stepped toward her, slow and deliberate, until there was only breath between them. He did not touch her, but his presence was enough. "Would you prefer that?" he asked. She hated that she hesitated. Hated that the answer was not as simple as it should have been. Finally she lifted her chin. No. A flicker of something, approval perhaps, passed through his gaze before he stepped back. Then understand this, he said. You are not free, but neither are you without choice. Choice. The word burned. She had spent her days waiting for the moment he would prove himself like all the others. And yet each time he defied expectation. Each time he left her with questions instead of answers. She did not thank him. Did not soften. But that night as she lay on the thin mat, the dagger still hidden beneath her, she found herself wondering not if she should use it, but why she had not. And that more than anything terrified her. The night air was thick with the scent of rain. The storm had passed but the ground was still damp, the earth softened beneath hurried footsteps. In the distance, the torches of the camp flickered like dying stars, and beyond them, the dark expanse of the forest loomed untouched by war. Freedom lay somewhere beyond those trees. She had dreamed of it for weeks, imagined herself slipping away while the camp slept, vanishing into the wilderness. Yet now, standing at the threshold of escape, she hesitated. He was giving her a choice. It should not have mattered. He should not have cared. He was still the enemy, still the man who had taken everything from her. And yet, when he pressed the reins of a horse into her hands, his face unreadable in the moonlight, something inside her cracked. Go, he said. The single word cut through her. No chains, no threats, no promises. Just the cold, unadorned truth of what he was offering. Why, she asked, the word barely more than breath. His expression remained unreadable. Because you have waited long enough for someone else to decide your fate. Her grip tightened on the leather reins. This should have been easy. She had spent every night preparing for this moment, waiting for an opportunity to slip free, to take back what little control she had left. And yet the thought of leaving him behind sat like a stone in her chest. You will be seen as a traitor, she whispered. A shadow of a smile crossed his lips. Perhaps. Or perhaps I was never truly one of them. She looked back toward the camp, the place that had been both prison and sanctuary, and then toward the trees, dark and beckoning. The choice had always been hers, but she had not expected it to feel this heavy. Do you want me to go? She asked. Silence stretched between them. Then finally he spoke. I want you to be free. The words stole the breath from her lungs. He stepped back, giving her space, but she could see it in his eyes. He was bracing for her to leave, preparing himself for the inevitable. He had always been composed, always in control, but for the first time she saw the truth beneath it. He was not letting her go because he did not care. He was letting her go because he did. Her fingers curled around the reins and for a moment she considered running. She could still disappear into the night, find her way back to whatever remnants of her old life remained. She could return to a world where she was not bound by the weight of his presence, where she did not have to face the impossible tangle of emotions he had woven into her. But that world no longer existed. She took a slow breath, feeling the cool night air fill her lungs. Then with quiet certainty she let the reins slip from her fingers. The horse stood still, waiting, but she did not move toward it. Instead she turned back to him. His eyes flickered with something unreadable. What are you doing? She stepped closer, closing the space between them. Making my own choice. A beat of silence. Then for the first time his composure cracked. You do not have to stay, he said, voice low, careful. She knew that. She had never been given a choice before, but now that she had one, the answer was clear. It had never been about the camp, the war, or the lines drawn in blood between them. It had always been about him. She reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against his, and in that moment everything else faded. The war, the past, the weight of what had been lost. None of it mattered. He did not pull away. Instead, his fingers closed around hers, steady and sure, as if anchoring them both to something neither of them had dared to name. And just like that she was no longer a captive. She was his equal. The morning came quietly, the first light stretching long shadows across the camp. The night storm had left the air cool, the scent of damp earth mixing with the distant smoke of dying embers. The world had not changed, and yet everything between them had. She had not left. He stood at the edge of the camp, watching as the soldiers stirred, moving through their routines with practiced ease. They had not yet realized the shift that had taken place, the choice she had made. But they would. And when they did, questions would follow. Challenges. Doubt. She approached, her steps light but certain. He did not turn to look at her, not immediately. He wanted to ask if she regretted it, if in the quiet hours before dawn she had wished she had taken the horse and disappeared into the trees. But when he finally faced her, there was no hesitation in her gaze. I have spent every moment since the war began waiting for a way to reclaim what was taken from me, she said. But what if my freedom is not in returning to the past, but in deciding my future? Her words settled between them, a truth neither had dared to speak aloud. He exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. They will not understand. She almost smiled. Do you? He did. And that terrified him more than he cared to admit. Before he could respond, a voice cut through the morning stillness. "My lord." A soldier approached, his expression cautious, uncertain. His eyes flickered to her before returning to the general. "There is unrest among the men. They are speaking of the woman." It had begun. He had known this moment would come, had prepared himself for the weight of it. Still, he felt the quiet press of something dangerous curling beneath his ribs. "Let them speak," he said evenly. The soldier hesitated. "Some believe she holds too much power over you. Pause. Others believe she should be dealt with before it becomes a greater issue." She did not flinch, though he felt the way her breath slowed beside him. He met the soldier's gaze. "And what do you believe?" A careful silence stretched between them. Then finally the man dipped his head. "I believe they are afraid of what they do not understand." As he turned to leave, the message was clear. The choice had been made, but it had not yet been accepted. The battle was far from over. She watched him closely. "You could command them to obey." "I could," he admitted. "But loyalty is not forged through force." "And if they turn against you?" He met her gaze, steady. "Then I will stand my ground." She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Then so will I." The words settled deep, anchoring them both in something unspoken yet undeniable. He had expected resistance, perhaps even defiance. He had not expected her to fight beside him. For the first time since the war began, he realized he was no longer fighting alone. The first sign of trouble came at dusk. The air had been thick with unease all day, tension coiling through the camp like a serpent waiting to strike. Whispers turned to murmurs, murmurs to quiet defiance. She had seen it in the way the soldiers looked at him, measured, questioning. In the way they looked at her, suspicious, resentful. She had not been blind to their anger. She had merely been waiting for it to take shape. The attack was not a declaration of war, not an open rebellion. It was something quieter, something far more dangerous. Yes. She heard the shift in the air before she saw the movement. The rustle of fabric, the subtle scrape of a blade being drawn. Instinct flared within her, a warning she did not fully understand, and then the strike came fast. A shadow lunged from the darkness, steel flashing in the dim light. He did not think. She moved. Her body twisted, reacting before her mind could catch up. The blade missed by inches, cutting through the air where her throat had been a heartbeat before. She stumbled back, breath sharp, fingers closing around the hilt of her own dagger, a weapon she had never truly intended to use until now. Another figure emerged, and then another. 2, 3, more than she could fight alone. And then he was there. His sword carved through the dark like a reaper's scythe. The first man fell before he had time to scream, the second barely managing to raise his weapon before steel found his throat. The third hesitated. Mistake. Blood slicked the earth. Bodies crumpled at his feet. The moment was over before it had truly begun. The camp had fallen silent. Those who had not fought now stood frozen, caught between shock and realization. They had not expected him to act so swiftly, so mercilessly. They had not expected him to spill the blood of his own men. But he had. Because they had dared to touch what was his. He turned to the others, gaze sharp as tempered steel. "Is there anyone else who would like to challenge me tonight?" Silence. She could see the fear now, curling beneath their anger, beneath the resentment that had festered for days. They had thought him compromised. They had thought her presence had made him weak. They had been wrong. Slowly he lowered his sword. Blood dripped from its edge, dark against the dirt. He did not look at her right away, did not speak. When he did turn, it was not to offer comfort nor apology. It was to offer the truth. "This is the choice you made," he said. She held his gaze. "I do not regret it." Something flickered in his expression, something unreadable. He exhaled slowly, then turned back to the men who remained. "Let this be your warning," he said. The next betrayal will not be forgiven. And just like that, the lines were drawn. The battle had not ended here. It had only just begun. The camp was different after that night. The air had shifted, thick with something unspoken, as though the earth itself had absorbed the blood that had been spilled and now carried the weight of it. There was no open rebellion, no more whispered challenges, but the silence that followed was far from peaceful. It was a silence of men who had seen a line drawn in steel and knew that crossing it again would mean death. She felt their eyes on her wherever she went. Some with barely concealed hatred, others with wary confusion. But none dared speak of what had happened. None dared acknowledge that the rules had changed. He was no longer just a captive. She was something else now, something undefined but dangerous. And yet, despite all of it, she did not fear them. Not anymore. She had stood at the edge of death and survived. Not because she had fought, but because he had. She found him by the river at dusk, his sword resting beside him, his hands braced against his knees as he stared at the dark water. He had not spoken of that night, had not explained why he had done what he did, why he had killed his own men without hesitation. He did not need to ask. She already knew. "You cannot keep protecting me forever," she said. His head turned slightly, though he did not look at her. "I can," she exhaled, stepping closer. "Then what happens when the war is over?" A long silence. The kind that spoke more than words ever could. "They will never accept me," she continued, her voice quiet but steady. "Even if they do not act against me, they will always see me as something stolen. Something that does not belong." He finally looked at her then, his gaze dark, unreadable. "Do you believe that?" She hesitated. "I don't know what to believe anymore." He studied her for a moment, then reached for his sword, lifting it slowly before placing it across his lap. "There is a way to change that." Her pulse quickened, though she did not look away. "And what way is that?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned the blade in his hands, the dying light catching the steel. "If I claim you," he said at last, "not as a captive but as my wife, no man will question your place again." The words landed like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. Not because they were unexpected, but because a part of her had already known. Had already feared this path, had already considered it in the quiet moments when her mind wandered where it should not. "Marriage is not the same as freedom," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it is power." She swallowed hard. "For you or for me?" His lips curved slightly, but there was no amusement in his expression. "For both of us." She wanted to deny it, to reject the idea outright, to tell him that she would never willingly bind herself to a man who had taken her as a spoil of war. But that was no longer the truth. She was no longer a spoil of war. She was something else now. And for the first time since her world had been shattered, she held the power to decide what that would be. The river whispered between them, carrying the weight of her silence. And then, after what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. "Ask me," she said softly. He exhaled slowly, as if he had been waiting for that. And then, with the quiet certainty that had always unnerved her, he did. And this time she was the one who held his fate in her hands. The night was heavy with anticipation. A hush had fallen over the camp, a silence different from the ones before. It was not the silence of fear or resentment, but of waiting, watching. Word had spread, traveling faster than she had thought possible. Some believed it was a ploy. Others thought it was a surrender. But no one could deny the truth of what was happening. She had agreed. She had stood before him, her voice steady, and given her answer. And now there was no turning back. She sat inside his tent, her hands resting against the fabric of her dress, one of the few they had found that did not mark her as a captive. It felt strange, the softness of the material against her skin. She had worn nothing but rough-spun garments since the war began, clothes meant for survival, not ceremony. But tonight was different. She heard him enter before she saw him, the faint shift of fabric, the quiet scrape of his boots against the ground. He did not speak at first, and she did not turn. She could feel him watching her, the weight of his presence pressing against the stillness between them. Finally he moved closer. "You do not have to go through with this," he said. She let out a slow breath. "Would it change anything if I said no?" Pause. "Yes." She turned then, meeting his gaze. "Would you let me go?" His jaw tightened. "I told you before, I will not keep you if you do not wish to stay." It should have been reassuring. It should have made the choice easier. And yet, knowing she could still leave did not bring her the comfort she had expected. She had spent so long trying to escape, so long waiting for the moment when she could finally reclaim herself. And now that it was here, she realized something that frightened her more than captivity ever had. She no longer wanted to escape. She studied him in the dim light, the sharp planes of his face, the quiet storm in his eyes. He had not asked this of her out of necessity. He had not forced her into submission. He had simply given her a path, a way to survive, a way to belong. But was survival enough? She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening in the fabric of her dress. If I do this, I do it as my own choice. Not because of war. Not because of what they say. He nodded. Your choice has always been your own. The words settled deep, anchoring her in something both terrifying and steadying. She exhaled. Then let it be done. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, but he did not press further. Instead, he simply extended his hand. A silent offering. A silent promise. She hesitated only a moment before placing her fingers in his. And just like that, the war that had raged within her for so long finally came to an end. The ceremony was not grand. There were no silks, no flowers, no songs of celebration. The warriors stood in a half-circle, their faces unreadable as they bore witness to something they did not entirely understand. A captive standing beside their leader, not as a prisoner, not as a trophy, but as an equal. The fire cast long shadows across the clearing, the only sound the crackling of burning wood. He stood beside her, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. He had fought 100 battles, had faced death without flinching, but now as he reached for her hand, she felt the tension in his fingers. There was no priest to bless them, no elaborate ritual to bind them. Only a few words spoken in the old tongue, an oath that had sealed the fates of warriors long before them. A promise. She did not speak at first. She only watched him as he turned to face her fully, his gaze steady, unwavering. And then, with a voice quiet but certain, he spoke the words. I take you as my own, not by force but by choice. The wind stirred between them, lifting the edges of her dress. He swallowed. Her voice was softer but no less firm. I take you as my own, not as a captor but as a man. The murmurs were almost immediate, a ripple of disbelief and uncertainty passing through the gathered men. But none dared speak against it. Not now. The blade was brought forward, its hilt wrapped in leather, its steel sharp and unyielding. The old ways demanded blood. Not in violence but in binding. A single cut across the palm, a mark that would fade but never truly disappear. He went first. The knife slid across his skin with practiced ease, a thin line of crimson blooming in its wake. He did not flinch. He merely extended his hand toward her, waiting. She hesitated. Not because she feared pain but because she understood what this meant. There would be no undoing it, no pretending it had never happened. This was not a game of survival. It was a choice that would define them both. Slowly she took the blade. The edge was colder than she expected, the sharp sting brief but real. She exhaled as the blood welled, then reached forward, pressing her palm to his. Warmth. It was the first thing she noticed. The heat of his skin, the way their blood mingled, sealing the oath in something deeper than words. The fire crackled. The wind howled through the trees. And as she looked up at him, she realized that everything had changed. Not just for her. Not just for him. For all of them. The fire had long since burned low, its embers glowing faintly in the darkness. The ceremony was over. The warriors had dispersed, returning to their tents in silence, their thoughts guarded, their loyalties uncertain. Some had accepted what had happened. Others had not. She could feel the weight of their stares even as she walked beside him, the night air cool against her skin. It did not matter that she had spoken the oath, that her blood had mixed with his. There would always be those who saw her as an outsider, a thing stolen rather than chosen. He led her toward his tent without a word, his steps measured, his grip firm but not forceful. She had expected him to say something, to acknowledge what had just happened, but he remained silent. She was the one who finally broke it. Did you mean it? She asked, her voice quieter than she intended. He did not stop walking, but his fingers tightened slightly around hers. Every word. She exhaled, her heart pounding in a way she did not fully understand. Inside, the tent was dimly lit, a single lantern casting shadows along the canvas walls. He released her hand and turned away, reaching for a basin of water. She watched as he dipped a cloth into it, wrung it out, then took her hand once more, carefully pressing the damp fabric to the wound on her palm. She flinched, but only slightly. "You should have let it be bandaged earlier," he murmured. She managed a small smile. "I did not think you concerned yourself with such things." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You are my wife now." The words sent a strange chill through her, not of fear but of something else, something unfamiliar. "And what does that mean to you?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead he finished tending to her wound before tending to his own. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "It means that no one will ever touch you without consequence again." There was something dark in his tone, something possessive but not cruel. It was not the voice of a man claiming ownership. It was the voice of a man making a promise. She did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing. He stood, moving away from her, unbuckling the straps of his armor with practiced ease. She watched as the heavy metal was set aside, leaving only the dark fabric beneath. He was no less formidable without it. If anything, without the armor he felt even more dangerous. No longer a symbol of war but a man shaped by it. She forced herself to look away, to focus on the flickering lantern, the steady rhythm of her own breathing. "You are afraid," he said, watching her. She lifted her chin. "No." Pause. Then slowly he nodded. "Good." He did not reach for her, did not demand anything from her. Instead he simply stepped back, leaving space between them. "You may sleep here if you wish," he said, his voice even. "Or I will have another tent prepared for you." It was not what she had expected. Not after everything. She met his gaze, searching for something. Some sign of deception, some hidden meaning. But there was none. Only quiet patience. The choice once again was hers. And for the first time since the war began she did not feel like a prisoner. The night stretched long and silent. She lay on the furs, her back to him, staring into the dim glow of the dying lantern. Sleep did not come easily. The wind whispered through the gaps in the tent, carrying distant voices, the restless shifting of men who had yet to decide how they truly felt about what had transpired. He had not moved. He sat on the opposite side of the space, one knee bent, his forearm resting loosely upon it. He was watching the entrance, his posture relaxed but alert, the stance of a man who never fully let his guard down. Even now, after everything, he remained a soldier first. "You don't have to stay awake," she said quietly. His gaze flickered to her, unreadable in the dim light. "Neither do you." She turned onto her back, studying him in the half-dark. "Are you expecting trouble?" A long pause. Then, "Not tonight." She understood what he wasn't saying. Not tonight. But soon. There had been no open defiance, no open rejection of what had happened. But silence did not mean acceptance. Some men followed him out of loyalty. Others out of fear. A few out of greed, believing his victories would lead them to wealth and glory. But none of them had followed him for this. "You knew they would not approve," she said. "I did. And yet you did it anyway." A shadow of something passed through his expression. "Yes." She hesitated. "Why?" He looked at her, then really looked at her. "Because you were never theirs to take." The words sent something sharp through her chest. She swallowed hard but said nothing. The silence stretched between them, different now. He had given her every opportunity to refuse this. And yet she had not. She had spoken the oath, had stood beside him, had chosen this path even knowing what it would mean. She had chosen him. That truth settled deep within her, more unsettling than anything that had come before. "You still do not trust me," he said. It was not a question. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. "Trust is not given. It is earned." A slow nod. "Then I will earn it." She wanted to ask how. She wanted to demand proof, to seek assurances that could not be given. But instead she only watched him as he finally leaned back, resting against the furs, his gaze still on the entrance. Neither of them spoke again. And though she still did not sleep, for the first time in a long time she did not feel alone. Dawn came slowly, casting a muted glow over the camp as the fires smoldered into embers. The night had passed without incident, but unease still hung thick in the air. The men moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for the day's march, but their glances were different now, sharper, heavier. They had accepted their leader's command without question before. Now they questioned in silence. She felt their stares as she stepped from the tent, the cold biting against her skin. Some looked away when she met their gaze, unwilling to challenge her openly. Others did not. There was no hostility, not yet, but the weight of their expectations pressed down on her, a reminder that her place among them was not truly secured. She turned to find him already waiting, speaking lowly with one of his men. His posture remained the same, calm, composed, as if he had not noticed the shift in the air. But she knew better. He had always been aware of his surroundings, always measured in how he handled defiance. The warrior beside him glanced at her once before lowering his voice, but it did not matter. She could still hear the edge of it. They are restless. They will fall in line, he replied, steady. The man hesitated. And if they don't? Pause. Then quieter, then they were never mine to lead. The conversation ended there, the warrior giving a small nod before stepping away. She watched as he turned toward her, his expression unreadable. Walk with me. It was not a request, but neither was it a command. He followed. They moved beyond the edges of the camp, where the trees grew denser, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. He did not speak at first, nor did she, but she could feel the weight of something unsaid lingering between them. Finally, he broke the silence. They will not turn on me, he said. But some will test me. She glanced at him. Because of me. A slight incline of his head. They do not yet understand. She let out a slow breath, folding her arms against the cold. Then tell me, what is it they need to understand? He stopped walking. He did too. He turned to face her fully, the gold of the morning light catching against the sharp edges of his face. That you are not a weakness, he said. The words sent something strange through her, something uncertain and unsteady. She had spent so long being seen as less. Something taken, something controlled. The idea that she could be anything else, that he expected her to be, was not something she knew how to grasp. And if they don't see it that way, she asked, voice quieter. His gaze darkened. Then they will learn. She searched his face, seeking the truth in his words, and found it. He did not speak to appease her. He did not offer reassurances he did not believe. He had made his choice and he would stand by it. But the question now was whether she could do the same. The wind stirred between them, cold and biting. She looked away, her thoughts tangled, her future uncertain. But when he extended his hand, steady and sure, she did not hesitate before taking it. The march began at dawn, the warriors moving in disciplined formation as the camp faded into the distance behind them. The air was sharp with the scent of frost, the ground hard beneath their boots. She rode beside him, her hands gripping the reins of the horse he had given her. It was a silent message to the others. She was no longer a captive to be pulled along, no longer someone to be watched from afar. She rode as his equal whether they accepted it or not. The morning passed in uneasy quiet. The men spoke in low tones, their voices carrying in the stillness, but few addressed her directly. They were still watching, still waiting. Testing. She felt it most acutely when they stopped to rest. Fires were lit, meals prepared, but the space around her was deliberate, too wide, too careful. No one turned her away, yet no one invited her in. She had expected this. What she had not expected was the man who approached her, his expression shadowed, his posture deceptively relaxed. A warrior taller than most, his face lined with years of battle. He had fought beside him, her husband, long before she had ever come into the picture. You carry yourself well, he said. It was not a compliment. She set down the piece of bread she had barely touched. Is that a problem? The warrior tilted his head slightly, studying her. The men wonder what you are. She met his gaze, refusing to look away. And what do you think I am? He was silent for a long moment. Then voice low, a test. The words settled between them, heavier than they should have been. She understood then, this was not about her. It was about him, about the man who had chosen to stand beside her when he could have left her in the dirt. They were not questioning her place. They were questioning his judgment. She forced her voice to remain steady. And have you decided how I measure up? The warrior let out a quiet breath, almost amused. Not yet. He left her with that, walking away before she could respond. The fire crackled. She felt its warmth against her hands, but inside she was cold. When he returned to her side, she did not tell him what had been said. She only glanced up at him as he sat, his presence a shield against the weight of the other's stares. He did not need his protection. But for now she did not mind having it. The evening settled over the camp like a heavy cloak, the firelight flickering against the faces of the men who sat in tight clusters, speaking in hushed tones. She could feel the tension, the way their eyes strayed toward her when they thought she wasn't looking. Some had accepted her presence. Others still measured her, waiting for her to falter, waiting for proof that she did not belong. She had never been one to shrink beneath scrutiny. He sat beside her, quiet as he often was, his attention fixed on the map spread before him. His fingers traced the inked lines, calculating distance, terrain, possible points of attack. He had led them through worse than this. He had no reason to doubt his command. But she knew the weight of uncertainty when she saw it. "They'll follow you," she murmured. His eyes flicked to her. "They question. They always have." His jaw tightened slightly. "Not like this." She watched the firelight dance in his gaze, the sharp planes of his face drawn in thought. He had risked much by taking her as his, not in the way a man risks his life in battle, but in a way that was far more dangerous. He had risked his standing, his authority. She had not asked him to, but he had done it anyway. And now, the ones who had fought beside him for years were watching, waiting to see if the man they followed had lost his way. She shifted, her fingers tightening in the fabric of her cloak. "You knew what taking me would cost." He nodded. "And I knew what it would gain." Something flickered between them then, an understanding unspoken, a balance not yet settled. He had not taken her as a possession. He had not tried to shape her into something weaker, something easier. He had chosen her for what she was, and he had accepted the consequences of that choice. But she was not certain she had done the same. A shadow moved beyond the fire, the crunch of boots on hard earth breaking the quiet. One of his men approached, broad-shouldered and steady, his gaze wary but not hostile. She recognized him from the battlefield, one of the warriors who had fought at his side long before she had ever known his name. The man hesitated for only a moment before lowering himself into a crouch near the flames. "Scouts returned," he said, voice low. "A small group ahead. Could be nothing. Could be waiting." He didn't react immediately. He only exhaled slowly, his fingers still against the map. "How many?" "4. Maybe 5. Armed." The warrior nodded. "Enough." She watched as he processed the information, every decision shifting behind his eyes like pieces of a puzzle. There was no fear, no hesitation, only calculation. And then he looked at her. Not in dismissal. Not in warning. But as if she too had a right to know what came next. She straightened slightly. "You think they're scouts?" "I think they're watching," he admitted. "Just as we are." Pause. Then he stood. "We ride at dawn." The warrior nodded, rising as well, disappearing into the darkness with the ease of a man who had long since learned to move like a shadow. She turned back to him, searching his face. "Do you expect trouble?" He gave a small, unreadable smile. "I always expect trouble." And somehow that did not frighten her.